Storytime with Stephanie Storey.
Hi, I am art historical novelist Stephanie Storey, and this is my show Storytime. My guest today was an award-winning public relations executive for like 30 years before turning to being a novelist. Her debut novel is called The 14th of September. Welcome to the show, Rita Dragonette.
Thank you very much. Very exciting.
Thank you so much for joining me to have a conversation. Before we get into all kinds of things that I'm interested in talking to you about, I don't like describing other people when they describe my books because it gets weird. Like, people make my books into other things. Will you tell my readers at home a little bit about what the 14th of September is about, and then we're going to talk about some things that revolve around it?
Absolutely. Well, the 14th of September is historical fiction. Its distinction is that it is a woman's story about Vietnam, and there are very few. And it follows the story of Private First Class Judy Talton, who is in school on a military scholarship, which is the only way she can afford to go to school. And yet, by the time frame of this novel, which is late 1969, she is starting to doubt the war and her role in it. So on her birthday, the 14th of September, she takes a fateful step and just tries to stick her toe into the other side by joining the campus counterculture, the anti-war movement, and doing it secretly. She thinks it's something that's exploratory, but it turns out to plunge her into a journey of self-discovery that ultimately leads her to a point where she has to make a decision that is every bit as fateful as that of any male lottery draftee at the time. A woman with you, and the intention that I had behind it was to present a female dilemma that was as emotionally fraught as the male dilemma going on at the time. And that dilemma at the time was, if I'm drafted, and I will be, at a time during the war when your life expectancy was as low as 6 seconds under fire, you had to make a decision. Do I go to Vietnam and probably die in a war that I don't support and the country doesn't, or do I go to Canada where it's a different kind of death? I'm alive, but everything I know has to start over again. And I thought, because I was really interested in the value of women's contributions and why they are undermined and marginalized, particularly in big issues, war being the biggest, I wanted to even it out. It's like, see, women can have these kinds of coming of conscience moral dilemmas. Just because there isn't a bullet coming at them does not mean that it's not as valuable, worthy, and difficult.
What did you learn about the Vietnam War by writing this novel, particularly from the women's perspective? Like, as you were writing it, as you're like delving into this story and you're unearthing this character and this story, did it change your perspective on the war at all? Did it give you new insight into it?
Well, I think the part of the issue is that it was based on some things that I actually experienced myself on campus during that time frame. So the research was in different levels, but having all of this perspective since then, and looking into all that stuff, is realizing we used to know back in the day that they were prolonging the war because they always used to say that America has never lost a war before and they were not going to make this the first one. And it seemed like all this testosterone and bravado and not worth losing all these lives over. But then when, all of the research has now come out, because it is 50 years, which makes it historical fiction, but it's living historical fiction, because a lot of the people that are involved in it are still around today and can offer their perspective. But what blew me away more than anything else was to learn that basically the reason that war kept going the way it did is that we came right out of World War II, and we thought communism was going to be like Nazism, and we needed to stop it in the same way and do the same kinds of things. And, we had just been in the Korean War, and they cut Korea in half, so what did? They cut Vietnam in half, and they tried to do the same things. And it was a very interesting thing to see that we didn't appreciate history, and we absolutely didn't appreciate that Vietnam, it was their war of independence. They thought we were intruders coming to take over their country. And so later you realize they never would have stopped. There was nothing we could have done. We weren't stopping communism. We weren't doing anything. And I think even Ken Burns says at the end of his magnificent PBS series, if you've seen that, I think every American should see that. But at the end, it's just nothing changed. There were only all of these people dead on both sides. That nothing was stopped, nothing was changed, there was nothing to change. And to me, that's just the quandary of war. It doesn't really solve anything.
Right.
And we rarely know what we're doing going into it. So again, back in the day, you had an inkling because we were all in the anti-war movement, but they didn't know what they were doing. But then all this stuff has come out to show that, oh my God, we really were sort of pawns in this bravado that we had. So that was revelatory.
I've been thinking about this a lot lately. Because we are living through such an extraordinary moment now in our history. And I've been trying to mentally compare it to moments from the way back history, since I tend to write about stuff that happened about 500 years ago, but also to more recent history in American history, trying to understand it. Do you see similarities to our moment? I'm talking about pandemic and Black Lives Matter and the whole kit and caboodle of this lately moment. To this moment of the protests against Vietnam, to this moment of American crisis that we were having at the time, I think over the war, that we're repeating in a different way now. What did writing this novel, what perspective did it give you on this moment from that?
Well, I think I actually do think it's astounding. I call it the hamster wheel of history. The things that we should learn and don't and do over and over and over again. But I actually wrote a piece for Ms. Magazine about this, which is, the conditions that are really the same. And it's, people are powerless. So if you look at Black Lives Matter, for example, if you're powerless, or if you hit the streets, let's put it that way, if you hit the streets, it means you went through all the channels and they got you nowhere. And it means you don't have the standing that you need. During the Vietnam War, the very people that were being drafted were not even old enough to vote. And that was the huge conundrum of the time. So that was the epitome of powerlessness. And actually, the first night, I don't know if you heard about the Black Lives Matter riots in Chicago, but the very first night, the rioters, they were protesters, but there were a lot of rioters and looters in it too, and they just trashed most of downtown with glass breaking and things. And I was driving home, because I live right downtown, I was driving home through that, and I got caught in it. And I knew, all these old feelings came back. I had been in those riots before, I knew exactly what was going to happen, and I knew I had to get out of there, that otherwise I would be stuck the whole time. And I kind of did a U-turn and went through, and I ran into, and there was this one woman holding up a cardboard sign that said, something like "silence is complicit." And of course, in our day, and I say it in the book too, that the reason that Judy has this dilemma, she's in the Army, does she stay in the Army, does she leave? It's a coming of conscience when integrity trumps consequences. And the word we used all the time was, are you complicit? And it's the same word. And then I turned around and I watched these people get ready, and they're jumping like fighters. And you just knew all this rage was in there. And I knew exactly what was going to happen. And I knew that glass would be broken. And also that the minute that glass was broken, people would stop hearing anything but the sound of that glass. And then fortunately with Black Lives Matter, it got much more peaceful in general pretty quickly, whereas we didn't do that. We ended up, there were a lot of people that didn't listen to the anti-war protesters because we got too violent, and it was all really a peace movement. So there's the subhead for the book, the 14th of September, I call it a coming of conscience novel. And coming of conscience is, my own definition is when integrity trumps consequences. And Vietnam's a time for that, and this is such a time for that right now. We also have leaders like, integrity trumping consequences means that doing the right thing will cost you, but you do it anyway. Right. So Mitt Romney voting for impeachment, the captain of the Theodore Roosevelt who gave up his career to save his men over the COVID scare. These things are happening now all over the place, and they were happening when people went to Vietnam. That was when they went to Canada instead of Vietnam. That was a coming of conscience moment. And decisions. Judy makes a coming of conscience decision. Who is she if she stays in the Army? What is it? What is she if she leaves? It's like not everything has a cost for it. We are so much in a coming of conscience moment now. Who are we as a country? What have we lost?
Having lived through it and explored it in this novel, do you feel hope that we're going to come on the other side, or does it make you more skeptical?
I think there's a different emotion too, because I would also say that back in the day of Vietnam, that's where terms like the generation gap came out, and the country was absolutely polarized between those who wanted to pull out of Vietnam and those who wanted to stay until the end, and families couldn't talk to each other across the dinner table, and it was as bad as it is. This is worse than that, but there are people that go, were the 60s worse? Was this worse? They're right up there. I would answer in two ways. I would say that I always had faith that we'll figure it out. The time frame of this novel also was the first anniversary of the assassination of Martin Luther King. And there were also riots on campus about civil rights and police brutality, and it was so similar. Yeah. No one listened, we inched, and then we threw it under the carpet, and now it's exploding. So we can't hide anything. We threw Vietnam under the carpet. It's the Voldemort of wars. Nobody wants to talk about it because we lost. There were atrocities. We were terrible to our vets. Now people are starting to look at it and realize we have to learn from this. Eventually, history is unfortunately really slow, and it's incremental. And even if you go back to feminism, it's the same way. My mother would have been 104 in October, and she had 2 daughters, and she did a lot of things. She was the vet overseas and all that, and she just said, I'm so disappointed. I thought we would have gender equality in my life. And I say that. And so I know that we'll end up being okay. My fear is how long it's going to take. But we are in a time now where we're going through change just like this, but similar to the 60s, which was like every minute. The late 60s, all of the 60s were different. I don't have experience of that, but the very late ones, we were just, it was in everything. It was in music and art and civil rights and war and feminism, everything all at the same time. And now we're going through changes, like unwinding a lot of the things we did before. So it's backtrack. So how long will it take to get right back where we were in the first place? That's the question.
You're basing some of this on your own personal experiences, which I'd read and then you just said. But so what made you, because you could have had a choice, right? So this means you could have written multiple versions of this. You could have written some nonfiction account, because you were talking about some of the details of the war. You could have written a memoir. You could have written historical fiction.
Most likely.
Okay, so why did you end up picking historical fiction over the memoir?
Well, because real life does not arrange itself in a very good narrative arc. That is the whole reason. When I really went back to the roots of this, I think that when I left the public relations business, it was to be an author, which was my original avocation. And I was going to do a memoir of my mother's experiences during World War II. She was an Army nurse. She had been 3 years overseas. She was in Patton's Army. She helped liberate a prison camp. She did amazing things. And right in the middle of it, she just refused to let me cooperate. So I decided then I will just go ahead and write my own story. But I had run into all these gaps with hers where either she didn't remember or she wouldn't. And it was like, oh, if you had only done this. And it's like, well, it's real life, you know? And in my own real life, the character that is most like me in the book is highly fictionalized at this point, to the point where sometimes if somebody asks me a question, I have to really think about, is that something that really happened, or did I make it up, and is that a real character, or whatever. But, you know, it just didn't have the drama and the arc, you know, like the whole second half of the book. It resolved in a way that was similar to what really happened, but how I got there was the real life was all much more interior and much less dramatic, and that is why you go to fiction. You know, you're saying the same things, you're getting the same experiences across, but you need that narrative arc. You know, it has to be a climax, it has to be rising and falling action, and that's why you do it.
You spent 30 years as a PR executive, and then you go and you write novels. What did you take from that PR career of telling other people's stories for so long? And then how do you make the transition into noveling, and what did you take from that career into your noveling career?
Well, I would take it back is that originally my avocation my whole life had been to be a writer. And public relations was ostensibly a writing career. You know, you had to take a writing test to get into it. It was a subset of journalism, you know, that kind of stuff. Now, it turned out to be more of a business career than a writing career, and I had no idea I would be good at it. But the process of constructing, say, a novel, same thing that you've done and so many of your listeners have done, it's very much when you're in PR, it's like you're trying to persuade someone to back an issue, back a candidate, buy a product, use something that's going to be good for them. And how do you do, what's the essence of something that will compel somebody to think about it? Is it a how-to? Is it what problem can you say this solves for somebody enough that they would be involved in it? When you're doing a book, it's all right, I have a story to tell, but what is the most compelling way I can tell it? What are the obstacles I can give my protagonist that will make people excited enough to be compelled to keep turning the pages? There is a strategy to the writing process, the same way that there was a strategy to the marketing process. And you know, it's not always like, it's not like I became a writer and then went, oh, I'm going to use all this strategy that I learned before, but it's just inherent. And you just kind of go, all right, what's the quickest way I can get there? Not the biggest way I can get there. You know, what's a 200-page version of this versus the 700-page version of it? Because I don't think my reader's going to want to listen to all these things that are tangential. But you know, it's a strategic process. Writing is strategic. So is PR. So is business. So is everything.
Okay, so it took me until I was 40 to publish my first one, Oil and Marble. How did that transition feel for you, for going from PR to a noveling and finally going back and doing this thing that you've wanted to do your whole life, which was the same for me? I've been writing since I was 7. How did it feel to finally put the thing out in the world? I mean, you're now 2 years in, so you've now had a bit of a time to process. How did it feel to actually do that, to accomplish that?
Well, it's like having a child, you know, but it's like having a child in your geriatric years, you know, because the whole process of it is actually really hard because it's a different kind of writing and then when you start, somebody once said your first book is always about yourself, and I think that's probably true in one way or another. And it's just so personal because it's so weighted. You don't sit there and say, oh, I'm going to have 3 books and put them in the drawer, and then I'll have one that is really successful. A lot of people end up that way, but you don't start thinking that's what you're going to be doing. And also, if it's in my case, a third career, so I went from PR to consultant to this, it's like I don't have that much time to waste. So the fact that I and I edited myself. It was like, oh, as long as it's done, it's okay. I don't care if anyone reads it. And then, of course, you put all that into it. It means a great deal to share your story. And that's a very satisfying thing.
But one last question, which is your fault because you brought it up before we started recording. But now I have to ask because I'm obsessed. I've written 2 books about the guy. This one's about his rivalry with Leonardo. This one's about his rivalry with Raphael. Michelangelo, you said you're a fellow Michelangelo nut. So tell me about how you fell in love with Michelangelo.
Okay, I'll tell you very specifically, when I was 16, I always wanted the creative life, and I thought the Italian Renaissance, if I went back in time, that's where I'd want to go, but I wouldn't want to be a woman because then we'd be married off. Mm-hmm. And when I was 16, I got a subscription to these Time Life books, and I got one on Michelangelo and one on Da Vinci. At about the same time, Irving Stone's book, The Agony and the Ecstasy, came out. And then the movie came out, and it was all in the Sistine Chapel, and the country that I will move to in my dreams will always be Italy. I've been there a dozen times. Florence is incredible. I mean, it just grabbed me. It grabbed me so much that I feel like that must have been a past life experience to be in that city. But just understood his obsession. That to be obsessed, it took him when he, the thing that blew my mind was when he died, he had commissions that would have required him to live until he was almost 500 years old. And he was in his 90s, so for his time, that was incredible.
Almost 89.
Well, okay.
Sorry, I'm weird.
It never occurred to him that biology would get in the way of what he was going to do. And I was so entranced by that vision. And everything in his life was that way. Now, it's not practical to live that way, but it was astounding. And he was good at everything. Everything he touched. Sculpting, painting, whatever.
So are you obsessed about something like that? You obviously got obsessed about this story enough to write a book. Are there other things that because when you admire somebody who's that obsessive, my hunch is, I am certainly really obsessive about things. My hunch is you have things you're really obsessive about. You have other things you're really obsessive about, which might perhaps suggest other things you're writing about.
Could be. Actually, I'm very obsessed about my own generation. I think it's fascinating. I think our sheer size and the bookends of Vietnam at one end, and then it used to be 9/11 and the financial crisis, and now God help us, it's the pandemic and everything. It's just the things that we have gone through how they've changed the world and how the individuals have been shaped in it. I just find really fascinating. And the reason, it wasn't only my own experience, but the reason I started with the 14th of September is that covers the 6 months between the first draft lottery in Kent State, and I feel that the character of my generation was formed in those 6 months. Now what I'm working on is a book that is a generational story, and it's an homage to The Sun Also Rises, Hemingway's book. And if you remember, that was expats in the 20s, bullfighting, fiesta way of life, wounds, but it was also lost generation and looking for meaning after war and devastation and all of this. I am writing a contemporary novel that is older expats that have now gone to the new expat capital of the world, which is San Miguel de Allende, Mexico. And they've gone there with their last dream. And the name of the book, the working title, is La Cadencia, which means the place in the ring where the bull feels safe, which is that's his last hurrah, because we know the bull will die. And the working tagline is, for a generation of dreamers, this last one really has to come true. That's my obsession. I feel like I'm writing books to interpret my generation.
One last question. So you won't be able to answer this yet because we're still living through the middle of it, but how is this pandemic and this moment and the protests, how is that affecting the way you're seeing your generation? Because if you're obsessed with that, this has to be changing that perspective, isn't it?
I have to be honest and say it feels like a massive bushwhack. Because just at the time, again, my theory, those of us who were around during the Vietnam War, we were raised to change the world. And we did a lot of things, but we didn't finish it. And then we went off into the new generation and took care of ourselves because we were disillusioned. But a lot of us intended to come back and use this last third of our life to go back and do that. And now look, we came out of school into a very scary world of Vietnam. And now we're at this stage in our lives just when we want to volunteer and go back and change things. All of our obligations can be around that right now. And then this, of all things, this plague is upon us.
Thank you so much for joining me and for talking about all of these crazy things with me. Thank you to my fellow Michelangelo lover. And I am also actually weirdly obsessed with the Vietnam War. So it was fascinating to hear your perspective on it. So this was just great. Thank you so much for joining me, Rita. Best of continued luck with the book and with the new book. We'll all be looking for it. We'll all be reading the 14th of September to prepare for the new one whenever it comes. This is all great. Thank you. And bye, everybody. See you next time.
Bye. Stephanie story time virtually. We've got time and plenty of stories, talking stories in a novel way. Story time with Stephanie.